All right, I'm Brad from Argon Dental. Today we want to just kind of give you an explanation of what a surgical guide looks like and how it should look in the patient's mouth, whether it's seated properly or improperly. So you can see on this surgical guide we have one site. Dr. Bublik is going to go ahead and insert the surgical guide in the patient's mouth. And you'll notice on the guide there are windows that we have 3 different windows where you can see through where natural teeth are kind of poking through, where you can have a visual of whether it's seated or not. So as you see right now, Jana's seated the surgical guide, and the incisal edges, you can see little gaps between the surgical guide and the actual incisal edge of the tooth. If you ever see that gap, that means the guide is not fully seated. If it's not fully seated, remember, we are not really guiding the implant precisely. So if that happens, you'd want to take the guide out, maybe do some adjustments in the interproximals to make sure the guide's fully seated, and kind of blow some of the acrylic away, where Jan's kind of pointing on those interproximal areas is usually where it would be holding up. So you would adjust that with a high speed. The other option you could have is maybe even cutting some teeth off in the posterior, because you might have an interference, and you can just cut the guide and lessen the amount of teeth that it seats on. That might help also get the guide to fully seat. But keep in mind, the surgical guide should only be made over top of an impression that is either polyether or polyvinyl. You never want to take alginate impressions for surgical guides. That's our number one reason surgical guides don't fit, is because we get impressions that are alginates. So remember to use a good quality impression material.
The other thing is, you do not want to cut through the window to get your window seated. You do not want to cut through in here like that, because then you don't know what you altered. So you always, if you want to remove teeth from the guide, remove these parts, but do not decrease the number of the windows.
Perfect. So Jan will go ahead and reseat the guide here, and you'll notice that if the process is done correctly, you use a good quality impression material, not alginate, you're going to notice as we seat this guide, and as Jan completely seats it, look at those windows. As a verification, you'll see that the incisal edges, and if Jan, you can point kind of the incisal edge where it seats completely, and you'll see there's no gap anymore, there's no black area there. That's a completely seated surgical guide in all 3 of those windows, and that's how you verify to make sure that that's fully seated. Also be careful as you're doing your drilling protocol that the guide doesn't slip up on you as you're guiding or as you're drilling, otherwise it is misguiding again. So make sure you keep a finger on the guide so it's fully seated.
So just kind of, make sure that when you take your fingers off, the guide doesn't fly out of the patient's mouth. And anytime you're using the guide and the drill, just make sure you're fully securing on the entire length of the guide. So in the back, in the front, and on the other side, right in here. Okay?